Good morning and welcome to the Point. This morning, our conversation with Lakeshore Congressman Bill Huizenga. We talked with the congressman after he met with constituents in Granville. We started our conversation with terrorism and our security. Congressman, almost 15 years after the attacks of September 11th, we're still dealing with terrorism in this country. We just most recently saw another vicious attack in Brussels. And the United States government seems to be struggling to know exactly what the role should be, what the appropriate role is. Obviously, that's a European problem, but there are concerns that that problem can easily be a United States problem. San Bernardino is not so far in the rearview mirror. Where are we today with our fight on terrorism, whether it's ISIS or whatever level?
Yeah. Well, and that's an interesting point right there, Rick. Whether it's ISIS or whether it's the lone wolf who either has immigrated or, worse yet, as we're learning, homegrown, like happened in San Bernardino. You can't treat all of those circumstances exactly the same, and we are getting better, but we've got a long ways to go. And obviously, as we saw in Europe, that's still probably a softer target than even what the United States is. We've got to get a lot better on a couple of different things. One is the screening. Two is on the financing. I sit on the Financial Services Committee, and we have a group that is looking at, a task force that is looking at terrorism financing, and that's stunning, I think, to most people to find out that that ISIS and other organizations in the group have literally taken over legitimate businesses like banks, like stock markets, those kinds of things, where they're a little like the mob. They have an illegal side of the house, and then they have a legitimate side of the house, both funding their efforts, and we need to get after those as well. So, but at the end of the day, it's about all Americans remaining vigilant, observant. Maybe as a little trite it seems, but the see something, say something really I think is important, especially as we're dealing with mass transit and as San Bernardino showed, it can really happen anywhere.
When you think back to Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, and obviously Osama bin Laden had his own family money and there was some financing there, but they weren't overall as well financed as we believe ISIS is. You talk about their legitimate businesses, but it isn't just legitimate businesses. They're legitimate businesses, and by the way, some illegitimate things that they do.
Well, like their oil.
Right,
you know?
But they have a lot of money. We've never seen a terrorist group financed like this happen.
Yeah, and a lot of that did come from their oil, and that's legitimate business operating in a gray area. There's embargoes, but there are people out there willing to pay for it. There's those who are willing to break the law to try to get at that. So we have not seen anything quite like this. Abu Sayyaf in southern Philippines doesn't have that kind of financial resources. Other places around the world where they have been problems in the past haven't had the types of resources that we're seeing flow into an ISIS and a few of these other groups like that.
Is there, beyond trying to go after those financial institutions and some of those things, that has to be a global effort? It can't be a unilateral effort on the part of the United States. What kind of cooperation do we get? I mean, obviously Europe, the European Union, and individual European countries are very concerned, but what about those big dollar countries in the Middle East from which some of this flows? I mean, are they participating?
Yeah, mixed. It really is mixed. And I'll add another region, which is Asia. You look at what's been happening, whether it's the Japanese banks. The Japanese have been very, very cooperative on this. The Philippines has been very cooperative. China, a little more spotty. Korea, they're very nervous about North Korea and what's happening there, and then you kind of shift down in around different places. But certainly the Europeans have had a bit more focus on that. I've recently, last fall, I was in Switzerland, and I'm going to be going back as well, having some conversations with the Swiss as to how their banking regulations and systems, how that fits with our needs today to be able to track these bad guys, these known bad guys that are going on. And even within Europe, some countries are better at others than some are better than others in sharing that information. So we got to continue to work with them. Look, money is fungible anywhere in the world. South America, Asia, Middle East, Africa, Europe, North America. It's pretty easy moving that stuff around, and then you don't even, the things you don't even think about always, Bitcoin, all right? Non-regulated systems that are now coming into place, are those a vulnerability? So we've got a lot of different things that we're trying to wrestle with.
I don't want to spend the entire interview on this, but as you were talking, I was thinking, in addition to the moving of money, we have the issues of moving of people. And I know if we get bogged down in immigration, we'll be here for the entire show. But the question about particularly immigrants that are refugees, people who have been displaced, and let's be clear that thousands of people have by the turmoil in the Middle East. What is our response as a government, and have we gotten a handle on how we should deal with as a country who is made up of immigrants and many of them refugees from places where life was not tolerable? It's a tough balance, particularly when people are concerned about their own security.
Sure, and whether it was economic refugees or physical war refugees, you don't even have to go back to World War II. My family was involved in, my dad was involved in getting Cubans here, and there's a number of churches in West Michigan that were part of that. That, and we all remember the Cambodians and the Vietnamese and others that came in the 70s. So we've had a rich history of getting people in here. One of the differences is you have a concerted effort now by an organization to seed bad guys into that, and they're kind of bum rushing Europe right now with a few of those folks. Obviously, legitimate refugees that fall under international conventions and treaties and that kind of thing. But we're wrestling with how do you start discerning who's neutral, who's good, who's bad. How do we deal with them? Some have proposed doing some sort of kind of refugee area, a free, safe zone, whether it's in another country like Cyprus or on military installations in the Mediterranean or European military installations, rather than just continuing to ship them through to pick at Germany, Sweden, Netherlands, Italy, wherever else. I've been very concerned, and I brought this up with Secretary Liu at our hearing. I was very concerned about some of the response from the Greeks. The Greek defense minister basically said, you need to have the IMF back off and quit telling Greece what we need to do. Otherwise, you know what, we just might send a few of these refugees through, and if there's problems in Germany, I guess that's on the Germans. Completely unacceptable, very irresponsible on the Greek government's part to even allow that kind of conversation to happen, especially, I think, in light of what happened in Brussels.
I want to talk more about the IMF and Greece. We'll do that in a minute. But I want to talk one more thing about security. By the time this airs, I will have just returned with my family from Washington, D.C., a place that I know and love and have lived. It has changed dramatically in the last 15 years. There are places that are now secured, the ability to instantly close roads that before were completely wide open. It's a much different place. Still, just recently, there was a shooting near the Visitors Center of the Capitol, which was constructed after 9/11. It's on the east front of the Capitol, where you go in and you can take a tour. When you're in Washington, and when many of your constituents visit up there, the security is obvious. There are more people with more weapons than you would see almost any place else.
Yeah.
Still, while this was not an act of terrorism, we don't know exactly, but this does point out the vulnerability that even in perhaps one of the most guarded cities in this country, the person with a bad intention can still create chaos. So we shouldn't lull ourselves into believing that just because there's security that we are somehow totally safe, because that lone wolf that you talk about, and again, not suggesting that this person was, but someone can always get through.
Absolutely. I mean, if you've got someone who is that determined and doesn't care about their own safety and well-being, whether it's an attack on the president, whether it's an attack on Congress, the Supreme Court, or a metro station, any of those kinds of things, it is the reality of what we have to deal with. And oftentimes you'll see those, whether it's armed security or cars and people watching. Most of the time, that's a deterrent. Frankly, a lot of the security provisions were put in place after 9/11 came from the Israelis. They've been dealing with this for decades in how to deal with that. But Europe had been at a different level than we had been. Before 9/11. I mean, it was nothing against the Capitol Hill police officers, but they were doing their job, but their job was very different. And half the time they were as much a tour guide, pointing people in the right direction, as they were about making sure that they were guarding the safety of those same people. That's a very different focus that's happening now, and that's again an unfortunate reality of what we're living with.
And that changed. I mean, that switch changed in a big hurry, even though one of their own had been killed in an attack at the Capitol well before 9/11. But again, it was a lone gunman type of thing, and someone who came in and who perhaps was deranged. So Capitol Hill Police, as you well know, as we both well know, have a big job, and they do it. I want to talk
and they do a great job. They really do. They're very responsive. The struggle that we have is we need to be as open as possible. We want to have that interaction with the public. We want the public to be a part of their government. Yet, how do you secure an area where you've got representatives from around the country and senators and the vice president or other world leaders coming into the Capitol? So there's a lot of conflicting desires, to that openness yet that security, and how you hit that balance. But they do a good job.
On the note of security, one of the things that you and I have talked about in the past is the collection of a lot of data off of our cell phones. Yeah. And recently this came to a very fine point after the shootings, the terrorist attacks in San Bernardino. The FBI wanted the company that makes this phone to unlock it so they could get to encrypted information. Folks at Apple said, well, we don't think so, because that makes all of our products vulnerable, and that's not what we've promised our customers. Yeah. So you had this real big matchup that was heading towards the courts between the Justice Department and Apple. But somehow, and when you mentioned Israelis a moment ago, one had to think that perhaps they had a hand in this. The FBI says they've now found the information. They've been able to unlock the phone. What does that mean for the rest of us?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think we know the answer to that yet. And I am not someone who is willing to put security above all. Because at some point or another, we have to have an open and free society, and we have individual rights that are enumerated in the Constitution. How do you balance that? That's the $1 million, $1 billion, $1 trillion question that we all struggle with, and people come down on slightly different places with that. So, it is interesting, and we'll see if we find out how exactly the Justice Department was able to do this. Did they do it internally? Did they work with somebody else? I know they said it was a third party outside. We don't know if that was a governmental agency of some other country, or if it was. I mean, for all we know, frankly, it could be a 14-year-old hacker that got in and was able to do that. But the truth still holds that the government has to be very careful about what information they gather and how they gather that information from us as citizens, because that is a vital part of our Constitution, is that ability to be a free and open society. And but how do we balance that just in the things that we were just talking about? The security that isn't just physical security oftentimes, it's internet security, it's integrity of our power plants, it's integrity of so much of our infrastructure that's out there. So we have to be cautious, I should say, as we're dealing with it.
When we return, more of our conversation with Congressman Huizenga. He'll talk about the IMF and FBI. If you don't know what those are, we'll tell you next. To the Point. Welcome back to the Point. Congressman Bill Huizenga serves the Lakeshore in the United States House of Representatives. We were talking about security of one type, and now security of another type, monetary security. Let's talk a little bit about another security issue. This is monetary security.
Yeah.
The IMF. You have introduced legislation, had the discussion about getting the Obama administration to deal with the IMF. First of all, I want you to explain a little bit what the IMF is, because it's not something a lot of people deal with on a daily basis.
Yeah. Well, the IMF is the International Monetary Fund. It's a post-World War II organization that was brought together to help countries in distress redevelop. Clearly, as you can imagine, their first focus was Europe. A post-World War II Europe was devastated with its infrastructure, with its economies, and the IMF came in and it was kind of a clearinghouse of expertise of how to deal with the ramifications and then how to sort of build it back up. Since then, it has expanded into, and once Europe was on stable ground, it expanded into other areas of the world as well. Africa, Asia, other places. They got pulled in during the Greek crisis, unexpectedly, not part of their intent, but Europe, in my opinion, didn't want to sort of be saddled with this entire responsibility. So they pulled in the IMF, much to the IMF's reluctance. The administration, the Obama administration, wanted to have the IMF involved. During the last omnibus bill, there was language that was put in place that was going to limit the IMF's ability to use something called exceptional access, and that's where Greece was actually qualifying. They bent the rules to allow any of this help to flow to Greece. They wanted some other reforms. We gave it to them, but said, okay, look, we need to make Greece a no-go zone for the IMF. This needs to be a European issue and a Greek issue to deal with this, not the IMF, which we're the largest member of. Unfortunately, the IMF, against its wishes again, got pressured by the administration and added language back in early this year that would seemingly qualify Greece to get help again. And as I expressed to Secretary Liu, I think that's completely unacceptable. First of all, because you just went against a bill that the president signed into law, agreeing that if we're going to make some of these other reforms, that we're going to limit the impact that the IMF would have. But two, it's not what the IMF is intended for, or really, frankly, what it wants to do. And a lot of the other truly developing countries, they're pretty ticked about it, and I don't blame them. They're like, wait a minute, Greece has had its shot. It's part of NATO, it's part of the European Union, it's got all these connections. We're here in sub-Saharan Africa or in other places in Asia. We don't have that help. And why are you taking those resources intended for us and trying to use them for Greece? And so we're trying to instill some common sense back into this.
Let me ask you a question that's a little off the beaten path, but as I was hearing you talk, I recall what it's like being in Washington during an election cycle. And very often it means that there is a lot of motion, but not much movement. Does anything get done on that or any number of other subjects until after November?
Yeah, it's typically sort of post-Easter. You have maybe until Memorial Day. Once summer rolls around, it's pretty tough to get anything of substance. Now, having said that, we are still working very hard on the budget and appropriations process. That is, though, within the House and the Senate, and frankly, I believe we need to get it done. We've got a bit of an impasse within the Republicans in the House as to how to proceed. Bills have to originate in the House of Representatives constitutionally. So hopefully we're going to be able to make some progress on this. We cannot continue to just fund government through continuing resolutions, and that's government ad hoc. It's just we're kind of making it up, and nothing substantive can change because it's just a status quo. And frankly, that's the last thing that we need in Washington, D.C. is status quo. We need to have some really true reform that takes place.
Let's talk about one other thing I know you're very interested in, and that is having government-run businesses compete with private businesses.
Yeah.
And this is not a new argument, by the way, but this is one that you have taken up to try. Well, I'll let you describe it. I was going to say perhaps to level the playing field when you had preferential treatment to a government entity. Give me your take.
Well, and that government entity specifically is the federal prison system, federal prison industries. It has a company called Unicor. Unicor, by law, is able to come in and say, oh, sorry, DOD, instead of you having a contract with that company for pick it, uniforms, gloves, whatever it might be. We decided that we're going to be in that business, and you must take our contract, regardless of terms, regardless of delivery, regardless of quality. We've decided that you have to take our contract. That's expanded to things like office furniture, which affects us here in West Michigan, laundry services. And you go, oh, okay, well, what's the big deal? Prisoners doing prison laundry. This is well beyond that. They're going outside the prison walls and going into a factory and a company saying, hey, by the way, we'd like your business. We'll ship it over. Don't worry where it goes. We'll get it clean and we'll get it back to you. But here's the thing. Taxpayers are footing the infrastructure bill, the lights, the warehouse, the machinery. They're paying an average of $1.05, I think it is, an hour to all of these prisoners. And this whole notion of using prison labor to take jobs away from private sector law-abiding folks just seems completely inherently unfair to me. And so we're trying to battle back at that. At one point we called it the Yellow Pages Caucus. Young generation has no idea what Yellow Pages are, right? They just Google everything and get on their smartphones. But it's that notion of if you can find it out in the public realm and can get that done, why are we going to have government, whether it's a state prison system or a federal prison system, compete against those hardworking taxpayers who are law-abiding? And this is well beyond prisoner rehabilitation. This is not about that. This is really, truly about them going after business and being a profit center.
But you've heard the arguments. You've been at the hearings where the folks will come in and say, look, if we don't have something for these prisoners to do, it makes the job of our jailers or our guards or anybody in the prison system that much more difficult. It makes the lives of the prisoners that much more difficult. So those who support that industry will say it goes beyond just providing a service or a good. It's also good for the prisons.
Yeah, and I would, you've got those two sides. I would say that we can have other activities that these prisoners can do to keep them busy. Because I don't want to put prison guards in danger. I don't want to put a prison system at risk. But I don't want underpaid, subsidized federal prisoners putting hardworking taxpayers out of work. That's not fair either. So give them activity, absolutely. Let them do services within their own prisons, absolutely. Just let's not have them putting law-abiding citizens out of work.
We're back with more To the Point in just a moment. So, as official Washington looks for more answers when it comes to security, both from terrorists and some of those money issues, we'll continue to follow a big presidential election that moves along. And of course, we've got two big conventions coming up this summer. Every Sunday morning, we'll be talking about that and more when you join us at 10 o'clock for To the Point.